JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to the second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session, which was fabulous, The Absence of Justice, John Ralston's Soul in conversation with Manjushri Thapa, or all of the other sessions with Elizabeth Gilbert, Ruskin Bond, Roger Highfield, Prayag Akbar, Marcus de Sotoy, Edmund de Waal, Alain Botton, Toby Walsh, and so many others. You can watch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our next session for the day is AK Ramanujan, A Poet's Diary, Krishna Ramanujan and Guillermo Rodríguez in conversation. The legendary poet, folklorist, translator, and scholar AK Ramanujan left an indelible mark on the understanding and appreciation of Indian literature around the world. After his premature death in 1993, Ramanujan's personal journals, diaries, and notes, referred to as the AKR papers, remained with the University of Chicago until his son, Krishna Ramanujan and Guillermo Rodríguez, edited them, published as Journeys, A Poet's Diary. They take us to the heart of the poet-scholar's vision and work and bring Ramanujan's luminous aesthetics to life. Krishna Ramanujan is a science writer at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Coupled with lifelong literary interests, he's worked as a writer for Earthwatch, Radio, NASA, and Cornell University, and has published more than 2,000 news stories and topics related to climate change, ecology, biology, and genetics. He's the son of AK Ramanujan. Guillermo Rodríguez is the founding director of Casa de la India, Valladolid, a pioneering cultural space in Spain. He is the author of When Mirrors Are Windows, a view of AK Ramanujan's poetics. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, AK Ramanujan, A Poet's Diary, Krishna Ramanujan, and Guillermo Rodríguez in conversation. Over to you, Krishna and Guillermo.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and this is actually very much in the spirit of AK Ramanujan. I think he would have liked this global connection, building bridges and connections, sitting in different parts of the world. It's a pleasure, and I hope we can bring the spirit and the aesthetics of AK Ramanujan's poetry and creativity to listeners around the globe. Let me just start by introducing very briefly the multifaceted aspects of Ramanujan. A lot of people have probably heard of some aspects of his work. He spanned over quite a few decades, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, before he passed away in 93. He had a lot of work which was still unfinished due to his premature death. But people may know him for his folklore translations. Folk Tales from India became a bestseller. Others may have heard of his amazing translations of the Vachanas of the Kannada Veerashaiva tradition. Speaking of Shiva was a landmark, a book, in fact, that people carried with them in their backpacks in the 70s, became kind of part of the hippie trail. And then we have his beautiful translations of the other mystics, the Alvars from Tamil Nadu medieval poetry, which goes deep into the aspect of mysticism as well as poetry creation. And of course, his beautiful essays covering all sorts of aspects, from women's tales, oral traditions. So if we have to remember Ramanujan, of course, for a major other aspect that is sometimes left aside is his own poetry, his own contemporary poems. He was part of the Modernist tradition, along with poets like Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moray, the pioneers, Parthasarathi, and so on, which started to identify in the 50s the traces of what was a new language, discovering a new language to speak and write in English language. I'm talking about Indian English poets, about a new idiom. And this is something we're going to discover today through some samples. I'm not going to explain much more because we want this to become experiential. We want this to become a journey through some of his diaries. And in fact, I'm very pleased that Krishna accepted to be also part of this session, because it's also our joint meeting together, and Krishna will explain it briefly how we got into this adventure. I had worked for quite a few years on Ramanujan already, and brought out the book When Mirrors Are Windows by OUP, and I had already glimpsed at the diaries from a different perspective. But after going back to on a book tour of actually at JLF in the US, I said, I was in Chicago, so let me go back to the diaries. There must be something more. And I had remembered that this is 2016. In 2014, some of the private diaries were left open for scholars, because typically in some of the collections of papers, you're not allowed to see some of the materials. So unrestricted material was available after 2014, and the diaries were part of it. And it was so amazing to see how a lot of his creative work was in those diaries, which nobody had seen before.
I just wanted to say quickly, thank you all for tuning in with us from all over the world. And I'll just continue a little context for the book, that in 2017, at the end of 2017, Guillermo contacted me to say that he had discovered a beautifully written journal entry of my father's travel from India to the US, and he sent it to me, and it was very, very beautifully written, as in real time as he was traveling. And I think it's a kind of metaphor for this book, that the book we call Journeys, but it's really an immigrant story of a man dreaming of leaving his small town and moving to the large world. And we see that what happens to him through this book. But kind of a remarkable thing is the entire book is in his own words. So we were able to cull from this vast amount of material aspects in the diaries that had to do with him being a creative writer. So it's less a personal book as it is a book about about his views on creativity, the creative work itself, which is in there, and travel logs, poetry drafts, and I think one of the things that Guillermo and I did is we had a very clear vision for the book, and that gave it a kind of cohesiveness, that you see the complete arc of his life created through his own voice and through his own creative work, which I think made for an interesting book. I'll just say a couple more things very quickly, and that is, doing this book really reconnected me with my father, who died in 1993. And so both Guillermo and I, for a year, kind of lived in his consciousness because all these entries were in his own voice. And I got to kind of experience this sense of being with him, which was a really amazing thing for me. It was very healing and very, reconnecting. And the last thing I'd like to say is that the diaries, though my father grew up speaking English, Tamil, and Kannada, the diaries themselves are almost entirely written in English. And in my house that I grew up in, my mother came from Kerala, my father's from Mysore city, and but their common language was English. So they only spoke English at home. So anyway, I just wanted to just give that context for the book Journeys.
Thank you, Krishna.
Thank you. So I'll start with the first entry, the very first entry. So my father kept diaries all through his life, from his teen years all the way through to his death. And that's how we were able to get this amazing material. And the very first entry we found was from 25th September 1949. And it was a kind of exercise. He was 20 years old, 1949, and he's writing about he wrote a little narrative about a younger self composing a poem and facing a kind of universal struggle that artists face of finding time to create within kind of the banalities of everyday life. It's written in third person, and both Guillermo and I found it quite a naive piece. He's quite a young artist, but it reveals this practiced and precociously talented writer. I'll just read a little section. This is from Mysore, 25th September 1949. A poem is born. He was writing a poem, definitely not about the raptures of roses and the languors of lilies. He would not be conventional, old-phrased, a panderist to the lazy public. No, not for the life of him. Tinned poetry, he called it, stale stuff. Not that for him. Good or bad, he would be himself, write himself, have his own home industry of phrases, where he turned poetic pottery at the whirling wheel of his own imagination. He would be clay, pot, potter, painter, and the tanning, fixing sun all in one. The fancy pleased him immensely. He wrote it down in his daybook. He had a small, neat hand with rather feminine curves and angles. He admired it secretly, thought of a young, worship-eyed posterity, thought of how he shyly concealed all that behind a modest mask of diffidence, which had the trick of becoming agonizingly real too often, the mask growing into the face. He lopped all those thoughts down. They were getting out of hand. He must think of the poem, his second.
Thank you, Krishna. I think we already see here, though he's 19-year-old poet, the idea which is becomes very much, in the later period, an obsession. That's the idea of the splitting personality of Ramanujan, the mask. And I think the entire the whole piece has this premonition about him trying to identify with what it is to be a poet, but at the same time what identity is about. And we're going to see this in the next few sections, because I think one of the things we wanted to underline in the selection we made is first of all the universal aspect, the striving of a poet, but also the singularity of a generation of writers like him. Some did not make it to the US, or dreaming about America and England. I mean, this is a period where people were quite ambitious. There's a group of scholars who are talking about the 1950s, where we had what the big masters we consider now. Anantamurthy, we had Girish Karnan was almost like a disciple of your fathers. We had Gopala Krishna Adiga. I mean, this R.K. Narayan. This is a brilliant period of time in South India, and in particular in Mysore, in Kannada. A very vibrant situation where things were kind of transitioning between the post-independence, the pre-independence, the struggle of becoming a new India. And I think the idea of Ramanujan trying to come to terms with these two worlds, and then eventually, as you said, as a migrant making it to the US, into another new world, is quite a striking metaphor already, and it also speaks for a generation of writers. I mean, all these most of them are gone now. Girish, we were fortunate enough to get him to write a piece before he passed away, the introduction, the preface. So we hear, this is the 1950s now, we're moving from the 40s to the 50s. So how does a small town news suddenly become so popular? It's interesting to see how he went to the US rather late. We're going to see this is 59. He was born in 1929, so he only went when he was 30. And he always thought he had to catch up with others who had made it earlier. But I think this period was very crucial, because the 1950s, he became a professor of English, first in Kollam in Kerala, then Madurai in 1951, where he wrote that famous poem, A River, which we're going to read now. Then the period in Belgaum from 52 to 57, where he got into field work and studying the folk tales and oral tradition. He didn't know at the time that he was actually doing cultural anthropology. because the whole concept of cultural anthropology was just becoming to emerge. And he was collecting folk tales. He was listening to what they had to say, the grandmother's stories. There's this famous metaphor of the upstairs and his father in the attic, Sanskrit and English, the father tongues, and then the mother tongues, the kitchen stove. So this is the period in the 50s, and he started to speak, give lectures, because he was kind of getting bored of teaching English all the time. So Girish used to say people traveled miles, 50, 100 miles just to go and listen to him, because he was quite shy, but when he started talking, reciting, people would really listen to him. So this is the period, 1950s, of a very important period in post-independence India. And the section of the book which deals with India before moving to the US in 1959, where we go out into the global world. So before we move to the US, and this is where the bridge kind of turns towards the West, we would like to read to you, Krishna, if you can read A River. I think a very apt poem to read in these times, if you want to comment briefly on it.
Sure. Yes, so this is a famous poem by my father, and you can see these dichotomies, as Guillermo was pointing out. And you see in this poem this kind of play and contrast between, the poetic, the romantic, the religious tradition is kind of replaced or set against, a kind of more realistic. Realistic and the cruelty or pragmatism of life and nature. And so you see this contrast between tradition and anti-tradition, which is something as well you see in the translations that he did. And this play against faith and fate and nature, and kind of being grounded, in a sense, one's feet on the ground, which as a person, day to day, he was very much in his own mind. But I think his best self came out as a poet when he wrote poetry. So this is called A River. I'm actually going to read from the book itself because it feels unnatural to read poetry from a screen. So I'm pulling up the book here. So A River. In Madurai, city of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and woman's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets sang only of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobble steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls, even before birth. He said, the river has enough water to be poetic only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart.
Thank you, Krishna. I think this is probably the most quoted poem by Ramanujan, even at high schools in India. And there's so many essays about this poem. I think what's interesting and symbolic about this poem is that it exemplifies the modernist idiom. In the 1950s, he mentions it in the poem itself. It's also self-reflexive. It says the new poets. So what are the new poets? The Navya period, as they call them. So they connect with the tradition that in English literature is called modernist tradition, because in other cultures, modernism means something different. But we're talking about T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, etc. And what do these poets believe in? They believe in the poetry, the language, poetic language, poetic form, that it's more about things, ideas in things, as William Carlos Williams said. So you can talk about anything in poetry. And I think, A.K. Ramanujan discovered immediately that for him, truth was in particulars, not in abstractions. And you can also, by foregrounding, these, like he's foregrounding, anonymous, a couple of cows. I mean, is that a subject for a poem? Traditional poets would have never thought of that. And also irony, the ironic. He plays with irony. It's a very British thing, of course, but it's very much part of the modernist poetry. And why do I mention this here? Because I think his poetry is very much connected to imagism and how he perceives objects talking to you. And we're going to see this even in his prose. So you can just, it's like pointillist paintings. You see all these dots, and if you focus on a section of a pointillist painting, you suddenly see a face. And it's also connecting to the idea of objects suddenly, at some point, if you really focus, they can suddenly dart into your subjectivity and become an idea. And that's what it's part of his aesthetics and poetics is all about. And we're going to see this both in his poetry and in his prose, because what was really interesting was to discover that he would have been a wonderful prose writer had he published his diaries. He probably thought of doing that, and I'm going to read a section where he does mention it. So as Krishna mentioned, we're moving to 1959. We have discovered this diary piece of the boat journey. I remember when I went back to the papers, the first batch of hidden or more set aside kind of a piece of bound piece of writing was a reflexive note on the whole trip from Bombay to Europe and to the US. And he had started typing it at some point, but we found the fresh new, the pieces that he'd left behind, unfinished work. So we're here now on the boat, 1959, the ship. He had studied linguistics at in Pune, and he wanted to be part of a Fulbright program. He got fed up with teaching English. It was probably already 10 years that he'd been doing that. And he was becoming an ambitious young scholar, and he wanted to make it to the West. Applied for the scholarship, and he got it. And he's on the boat, discovering for the first time the flavors of something new. And that is by observing everything that's coming to him. And it's like, as he said, it's like a spree of images that come to him, and he's trying to put that in writing. So he's also talking about isolation, because it's so alien that he feels a bit challenged by all of this. So he's on the Straight Hut ship, which he boarded on 1st of July from Bombay. And the ship actually en route stopped obviously at Suez Canal, Aden. It went through the Mediterranean, and the first contact with the West was Malta. After that, it was supposed to reach England, but on the way, the ship's engine broke, the second engine, and they actually had to stop in Marseille. And there's another long piece where he describes the trip through France, and he made it to Paris, which he dreamt about. So kind of the unsuccessful boat journey became a very successful personal experience. I'm going to read now July 17th, 1959, Malta. His first experience with Western architecture and imagery. And this is the paragraph. July 17, 59, Malta. To have lived in dozens of such exotic places till they are exotic no more. To have absorbed them till one understood their life ways and their stress. To live at ease among strangers. Even in India, one could have done all this, but one didn't. One feels like rushing back and gathering all that experience one has missed, all in one back-breaking burden. I seem to have gathered nothing, shared nothing of my past. Every moment seems an alarming fresh beginning. Everyone has plans because their future is continuous with their past. I seem to carry nothing, not even ideas. I hope that fear is not true. The more I gather these images, the more intense is my craving to be a writer of prose. Fixing these tantalizing images in words, this haze, the twinkling spangles on the sunlit bays, the sky fretted by the trees that look through the arches, the penciled aerials, the blood-red oars of a green boat, the red underside, this woman in a white dress with penny-sized spots of black, the blue jerseyed deck tennis players, this desire to talk to my steward, and that sad-looking flaxen-haired small woman with a typewriter, and the sudden responsiveness of an acquaintance, and all the small hours with the heavy procession of the images of my isolation. So it's a way of explaining that he can't process everything that he sees. He's very much there, but in the beginning of the entire book, it's like he's not really there. He's completely isolated. He's trying to come to terms with that. So we return to that idea. But maybe Krishna, if this is the first hyphen moment, maybe what we call, he thought or described himself as the hyphen in Indo-American, ironically. Would you describe this maybe as a hyphen moment, Krishna?
Yeah. So I'll read another section of this. And as Guillermo was saying, he was bridge building between cultures, and he described himself as the hyphen in Indo-American. It was a kind of witty comment that he made that a lot of people refer to. But the hyphen is also a metaphor of the journey from, as you see in the book, this is kind of a turning point in the narrative of him moving from India to America. And so it's not only, the hyphen is not only external, but also what we want to point out is also within himself. He's always feeling between. And in these passages, as much as anywhere, you see his discomfort in his own identity. It's kind of his condition to be between worlds, and he's uncomfortable everywhere. And it is within him, but he also externalizes it. He sees it in every moment in his external surroundings. And this is very much comes through in this next section I will read. But you see this kind of thing all throughout his work. It's a major theme in his work. So I will read this. I also like at the end of this section, I'll read a little section where he talks about being an Indian intellectual in the 1950s. And it continues this idea of not belonging and not having a place, even within India, as someone who is devoted to being a scholar and literature and an artist. He felt quite out of place. So I'll start here. 6th July. Afloat with almost no past and no near future but the sea, just afloat in the depths of the present. Discussions are aperitifs. Time seems to have held its breath on a semicolon here, and space has a vague, slow curve going around us all. Too many people have faith. Easily they speak of unspeakably intense experiences, which changed them entirely and gave them and their world a new look. Today it was Miss Malani. Yesterday it was Eknath Iswaran. Both seem poised in their faith. I feel small and lost and infantile, disturbed by their peace. I was telling a young Australian how isolated an Indian intellectual is, with 16.6% who can read at all, and an overlapping 20% who are in cities like him, and only about 2% English knowing, and still fewer having his rationalist views, with fathers highly educated and mothers ignorant but strong in their hold on him, with every prudent man having a caste and insisting on it, and he having none, but not modern enough to be entirely abreast of Western ideas, because books don't come too fast to India.
Thank you. I think this also shows about, self-criticism. And if you take it to the personal, of course, another strain which goes through his diaries is identity search, but also doubts about, how he can come to terms with becoming a whole. I think the fragmentation remained there throughout his life. I'm going to read, since we have to move on and we want to cover till at least the 70s. I'm going to read only 2 sentences where he sums up. He wrote this after he arrived in the US, and he wanted to turn this entire journey into an actual publication. So he started typing things. And I think this paragraph sums up his feeling. And this is the very beginning of the journey. He says, somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean from Bombay to Europe, he wrote this, and then he typed it on his typewriter. As one is disengaged from the family, the familiar, everything puts on the stranger look of a symbol. The journey itself, the seed's self-exile, the salt estranging sea, the towboat, the guy ropes, the receding wharf with its belittled crowd, its motley of mothers and wives waiting for the emptiness, the sudden need for telescopes. There's everything here, but everything is anonymous till one sees, quote, the faces in the crowd. And I love this last phrase because he's actually quoting Ezra Pound from a station in the metro. I mean, what is a strangeness? What is a stranger? What is a migrant? You become a migrant, everything is strange to you, but you're a stranger to the rest. At the same time, everything you see is abstract. So he's saying everything is anonymous till one sees the faces in the crowd. So the object suddenly, in that intense moment that Ezra Pound described, where you look at something and look at one of those anonymous faces, which for Ezra Pound was the metro station. Here he sees all these people, and suddenly one of those faces, you pick them out, and kind of the object darts into yourself, an identity. And this is interesting because it connects with another poem which is of this period, which is titled Self-Portrait, where he talks about himself being a stranger. So one thing is to see the world around you as strange and others seeing you as strange. But what happens when you see yourself as a stranger and you don't know who you are? And that's a very interesting aspect which he struggled with throughout his life. So that's why we wanted to read out to you this poem, Self-Portrait, which, again, when I found this first draft, it had a little note on the side saying Borges. Borges is the Argentinian poet who wrote The Doppelganger and The Double, who was very much obsessed about the idea of the mirror and so on. And we're going to see this in this very short imagistic poem. If you can read it to us, please. And it's also very significant that the son of Ramanujan reads it, because he's mentioning about his own father. So it's kind of the lineage we keep alive there. Please, Krishna, read it to us.
That's right. This poem takes on a whole new irony when I read it. So here it is. Self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.
Thank you, Krishna. We don't have much time left, but I think there's a lot to be thought about a poem like this, where he actually, the fragmentation, and he liked the idea of glass, right? Because glass, it has refractive and reflexive properties, so you can see through and see something, but at the same time you see yourself. So there's a very powerful metaphor. Shall we read the flight journey and then a couple of pieces of the masculine experience, and then end with the final poem?
Sure. Yeah.
We have this piece where he. This is kind of funny because he's boarding what we think was his first flight ever, and he's flying to New York. Probably from somewhere not too far, because the journey is only a couple of hours, and he's never been on a plane, right? He compares it to a bus. So this is this first part. Again, this was scribbled on a napkin and other pieces of paper. So he's actually he was very good at improvising, kind of very jazzy, and it's written almost as a poem, but he was writing it as he was experiencing it, which we see later on with the masculine note. So let me read this. 13th April 1960, a first flight to New York. I got in. It looked like a good bus inside, with the driver locked out in the front, the air hostess opening the door now and then to let us peek at a panel of dials and red pin lights, like a radio station. In the back of the front seat, white bags for air sickness with English and French legends. I read only the French, of course. And the plane started quaking, and I hastily, with great and clumsy care, belted myself into the seat, next to a rather unclean window, looking out on a noisy monster of an engine. Then it moved like a ramshackle bus. It seemed to me rather aimlessly all over the place and wended its way to a cement strip, nose-led by a small white nurse-like little plane showing the way, and started running faster and faster and lunged upwards step by step. This goes on now. Krishna, do you want to read the Beyond Pittsburgh part?
Yeah. Beyond Pittsburgh. Jags of blue-white flame with a dull red glow at the source, at the side engines. The city looks a Milky Way of sparks and winks, darkness and cigarette stubs pulled at by invisible spaces. Sometimes like a skew plotting of light dots on an IQ graph with no scatter at all. Sometimes like a pontillous Surratt lit up. Surratt being George Surratt from the latter 1800s, French post-impressionist who devised this pontillous style. And I just wanted to say that, here we have another literal journey, but also, you can see how in every moment he's so almost obsessed with his craft that any opportunity he has to practice, even on a plane flight, whatever he's doing, whatever he's experiencing, he wants to practice poetry and his craft and his observations. I think that's really quite interesting. It's a testament to his devotion to what he did.
Maybe we would like to end with explaining how he saw this whole process of writing diaries also as a methodology, as a method to write poetry, because he would write down things that he later use as material, but also as a kind of therapy. He's very much about into Jungian psychology. It was a therapy, but also the idea of playing with public and private. And I think that notion we want to briefly highlight, because before we read the final poem, for him, it was very much about Akam and Puram. This is the private and the public, which he got from the Tamil Sangam poets, how the public may become private, the private becomes public. So there's a phrase where he says, in 1976, I've been writing a journal for some time, chiefly notes to myself, with no pretension to style or scholarship, but as explorations, passages from one thought or feeling to another. I needed them to form my thoughts, to see what I was looking at, to listen to what I was hearing. And I'm publishing them now, making them public, so that the private may find a place in a larger discussion, just as the larger discussions entered my private journal. And there's another wonderful piece where he talks about somebody else reading his diary, which was not his intention, and that is his wife. Mali. Krishna, you want to comment on that, please?
Yeah, so there's a section here. My parents had a very on and off kind of can't live with him, can't live without him kind of relationship, him and her. And so again here, it's actually very interesting entry because you see this play between public and private, and posterity as well, and his intention to publish his diaries is all here. But he's here talking about the Tolstoys, Sophia and Leo Tolstoy, who kept 2 diaries. And so I will, or Tolstoy comments about whether he should. So I will read this from 5th October 1980. It's quite funny. If you knew anybody who knew my parents would understand the humor in here. 5th October 1980. Trouble writing this diary. Molly, my mother, Molly said she'd read much of my diary, don't know when, and checked against what I said to her and found me a liar. Curious situation. Should one write a diary to suit a possible snooper, a reader over your shoulder? Tolstoy and Sophia are supposed to have kept 2 diaries, one for each other's spying and to outrage the other when he or she does, the other truly private. I'm going to contrive to write what I think and feel, for the first honesty is with oneself, and what I don't put down vanishes as my memory blurs and doesn't keep details. So, and I just wanted to make one last comment. This line about the first honesty is with oneself is, in his poetry especially, he's very, very honest about himself and his thoughts. And I think, as he had this famous line of betray yourself at every turn in your writing. And I think that's that honesty. In his writing, he was able to be very open, and that made him, I think, it really comes through. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Krishna. There are some questions here which I'd like to read out now from the audience, because we may have to move now to interaction with the audience. There is Sudip Sen, who wants to know how did AK Ramanujan negotiate bilingualism and biculturalism, both public and private, that were always a constant mirror and shadow all through his life? I think we've partially answered this question. It's a very tricky question because it would take quite a long while. Maybe you want to comment on that. And then there's another question, since I want to couple 2 of them together. Mrs. Chauhan asks, do you think your father contemplated his journey, or was his becoming a cultural interpreter an organic path? So was it either, the way I understood this question, he planned it, or was it becoming a cultural interpreter, or was it an organic process? Perhaps you want to reply to the second question first.
Okay, yeah. I think I would say both, because he was a very self-conscious man. And also because he was constantly writing and recording his life, as you can see in the diaries. I think there's a sense, and all the way through, even that first entry that I read, you see this notion of posterity. He's in the back of his mind thinking about some kind of, I don't know, greatness or some idea that his work is going to live on. And I think he wrote it with some kind of intention that he wanted to be someone whose work lived past him. And so I would say his self-consciousness makes him aware in some ways of his place and what he is doing. Guillermo, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, it's connecting with. I want to combine it to the first question. About negotiating bilingualism and biculturalism. I think the whole difficulty and strain of being in between worlds, you have to be true to one world and then to the other world. I think he described it very interestingly in his own. I think the way he was able to figure this out and survive with it was translation. I mean, the act of translation, he was constantly translating. And I'm not saying only in languages, he was translating between times, cultures, periods, traditions. And I think this is where the creativity came out. It was through translation. And that's why he did it so brilliantly, because he was at the same time aware of the potential reader. And not only in his diaries, but also when he did the translation, he was aware of, he said, you have to translate the reader rather than the text. So when he translates these amazing, very strong vachanas, which have almost become like hymns, Basavana or, Akka Mahadevi, which is so powerful, he has to put it into modernist idiom, not because he wants to make it a point that they might be similar to the modernists, but I mean, there's ages apart. No, because he wants the Western reader to experience or to imagine what it was to experience something fresh, colloquial, conversational. So he's actually aware of where he's going to be read, rather than consciously, betraying the material. And I think this is very much the process and the creative process. That's how you can negotiate. You have to be true. And it's not bilingual. He was multilingual. So Tamil, Kannada, and other languages. But when he spoke or wrote in Kannada, he wanted to be, he used the metaphor of the string. When you pluck a string of a sitar, there are all these other strings, the harmonic, the resonating strings, and all the resonating strings that are vibrating along with the note is the whole world that he lived with. So through one single note, he wanted everything else to reverberate. But you have to be true to the sound. You have to be true to that particular moment, that particular language. I think if that perhaps answers the question, this was possible.
I'll add just a little bit about from the personal side, that he, this idea of, in America, like I said, in our house, my mother was also a very highly educated woman, very brilliant woman, and she, so they only spoke English. They both spoke fantastic English, and so he only spoke English at home, but he also preserved, for me, I was raised by Indians, truly, like that, even though they were artists and bohemian and into experience, and in many ways, trying to be modern, what we call modern people. He wanted to be a modern man, for example. He used to, there's this idea about him that way, but he preserved many of his habits of Brahmanism from his childhood. Mm-hmm. Those sort of cultural habits of, he would always say everything in moderation, and things like that. When he ate, he put just little bits of food on his plate, So it was, there was this kind of, the traditions did not escape him. They continued subtly in the background.
Yeah, though we didn't have time to go through it, he shunned his Brahmanism, he threw away his sacred thread, and he always tried to experiment things, but in moderation. Like the one piece we didn't have time to read now, where he actually tastes hallucination, and he went into this hallucinogenic trip where he tried mescaline once. I think this is a once in a lifetime experience he had, but at the same time he looked at it as a poetic event rather than a personal one, and he wrote everything down. Everything he experienced, just like Aldous Huxley had done, but alone in a room, not with somebody writing it down for him. So experimenting and going out of the way, but without breaking barriers, so that he would. He was also aware of quite afraid of, in a sense, of criticism, and that brings us to the next question, which is by Sajdev Ramakrishnan. He asks, "Your father was, in a sense, multidimensional poet, folklorist, philologist, scholar with views of the East and West, and then the contrarian 300 Ramayanas. In his summary, what was he?" And then there's another question by Arunji saying, "Is there any influence of changes in the country in his works?" I don't quite understand this question. I'll read it again. Is there any influence of changes in the country in his works? I don't know if he means the changes that happened in India from the 50s to the 90s. Would you like to comment on that, Krishna? Any of the two points?
Well, the first one, what was he? I think he is all these things, and that's the his interest, like his father said when he was young, that going into his room, if you looked at his bookshelf, he called him intellectually promiscuous, because he had so many interests, and he was almost interested in everything. And so if you proposed something or talked about something to him, he would go and read about it. If I talked about ecology, or if I talked about some thought that I had about something, he would go and spend some time researching, anything that popped in his mind. Oh, I wanted to point out something. He used to, in the diaries, he used to take these notes, right? And I have his copy of Samskara, this translation of You Are Anantamurti. And in here is this 3x5 card. He used to carry it. He used to carry these around with him, this pad of paper in his pocket, and he would take these little notes. And so I found this. When I read this book, I found this and I use it as a bookmark. But it has his handwriting on it, and it's one of these 3x5 cards. But he was interested in everything, and I think whenever something caught his mind, he would write it down, and he would go and research a little bit about it and understand more. So I would say, in terms of what was he, I think he was all those things at once, and that was kind of a remarkable thing about him.
Thank you, Krishna. We've come to an end. Let me just comment briefly on the last question. I think changes, definitely he was very much aware of what was going around him, and there's a quite a visible strain also of political points, but it's not obvious in the first sight, or even what was happening with in the different parts of the world with, for instance, the Biafra. Then there was something on, I remember the war with Serbia, Croatia, the Balkans are present. Political issues are very much there, but he wasn't interested in the political aspect itself. He was also aware of how this could affect poetics and aesthetics, and he was quite challenged by postmodernism, post-structuralism, and he tried to kind of relate to that. And I think this is the sad part of the whole story, because he died too soon in 1993, when he was just trying to explore and come to terms with these intellectual challenges, like Derrida and other poets, other scholars who were challenging structuralism. He was a structuralist at heart, but I think he was quite comfortable also with some of these new ideas, because his idea of believing in fragments rather than in truth. So to end, Krishna, I would really want you to, I know you try sometimes to put the task on me, but would you please read this last poem, which was on the flagpole when he passed away. Some student had put it up on the campus in Chicago, because as you all know, he just passed away on the operating table. It was a big surprise to everyone, a big shock. So he was only 63. Would you please read, just to end this last short poem, and
Sure.
leave it
I'll read it. And just to, my mother and sister and I were walking on the grounds of University of Chicago campus, and the flag was at half mast. And we walked closer, and someone had taped this poem to the flagpole. A Hindu to his body. Dear pursuing presence, dear body, you brought me curled in womb and memory, gave me fingers to clutch at grace, at malice, and ruffle someone else's hair, to fold a man's shadow back on his world, to hold in the dark of the eye, through a winter and a fear, the poise, the shape of a breast, the pair's silence, in the calyx and the noise of a childish fist. You brought me, do not leave me behind. When you leave all else, my garrulous face, my unkissed alien mind, when you muffle and put away my pulse, to rise up in the sap of trees, let me go with you and feel the weight of honey hives in my branching, and the burlap weave of weaver birds in my hair.
Thank you. Very powerful poem. which sums up his notions on body and afterlife. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you, JLF team. Sanjay, you want to take over? It's been a pleasure, and of course, poetry has to speak. So we wanted to read as much as possible, but we had other pieces and pieces ready for you. But I think all can go and grab the book and maybe have a deep dip into it.
Krishna Ramanujan, Guillermo Rodríguez, thank you for that really evocative and beautiful, beautiful session. And Krishna, in one of the photographs, the one with in his jacket and tie, he looks so much, or you look so much like him, slightly.
And his voice also, his voice.
It's incredible. The resemblance is incredible. And what beautiful poetry he made. And yeah, just what was he being operated on, Krishna?
He actually had a small tumor in his neck, and for the last years he had phantom pains in his legs, and no one knew. They couldn't figure out what. But then they discovered a small tumor. He was going to have it removed, but he actually had a cardiac arrest. One of his arteries was 95% blocked, so he was a walking, ticking time bomb. At some point, this was going to happen to him. It seemed apparently soon. He was quite nervous before the operation. And he actually settled a lot of his affairs prior to him going in, as if he had almost a premonition.
Well, the good pass early, and but he left behind work that will, thanks to both of you, I think, in so many different ways, have rediscovered it. And I remember the many years that Guillermo used to be working on the papers, and he used to keep coming back and saying, next year it's going to be ready. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it once it's done, because it was always in progress. But thank you both so much for that wonderful session and bringing alive AK Ramanujan and everything that he stood for. And I'm sure his work is available. You all can go and access it from Amazon. So I hope you're going to get his works and sort of delve much more into the beautiful poetry that he's written. We thank our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho, and please do remember to log in on Wednesday, the 8th of July for Writing About Writing. Andrew Sean Greer in conversation with B. Rowlatt. Andrew Sean Greer's relentless lampooning of the literary world less won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. This novel about a novelist tells us about the crazy quilt of a writer's life. Warm enough, though it never quite covers the toes. In conversation with B. Rowlatt, he speaks of the highs and lows of the writing life, of the doubts and epiphanies in the constant struggle for experience and self-expression. This is at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The second session on Wednesday, the 8th of July, will be The Battles Within, Addressing Mental Health. Shailaja Sen and Anna Chandy in conversation. Anxiety and stress are the order of the day. Transactional and analyst and counselor Anna Chandy and Shailaja Sen, narrative, a therapist, author, and co-founder of Children's First, speaks of strategies of coping at a time when the pressures of the lockdown affect children and parents, as also the lonely and the isolated. A crucial conversation for our times. You can tune in at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Stay safe, enjoy the weekend, have a great 4th of July. Remember, mask up. America, if you're stepping out, important, you were at 55,000 cases yesterday. Stay safe. See you on Wednesday. Thank you.